Homeland Security Secretary and retired Marine General John Kelly joins me now. Mr. Secretary, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jake.
So President Trump warned last night that a, quote, major conflict between the U.S. and North Korea is possible. Hours later, we see North Korea fire this ballistic missile. Do you think North Korea's actions this evening makes the major conflict that the president warned about as a possibility more likely?
Well, I think they're not fast enough to put a missile launch. I don't believe they are, and I don't know what kind of missile it was, Jake. But I don't think they're fast enough to put a missile launch together based on what the president may or may not have said last night. This was probably something they had planned. They could certainly have slowed it down, but they seem to be pretty intent on developing the capability, both missile technology as well as nuclear technology. And you know, it's a real concern for anyone that knows about the possibilities of them linking a missile to a weaponized atomic device or nuclear device.
The missile launch is believed to have been a failure. That's the word right now. Has the U.S. used its cyber arsenal to sabotage North Korea's missile program?
Well, if I knew that, of course, I couldn't comment. But I don't know. It's you know, this missile technology business, and you know, I'm not a scientist or a technotype. But the missile technology business is complicated. They've got some pretty good scientists, obviously, but they don't have people like we do in the numbers we have. But it's pretty complicated business, and whether it was you know, destroyed itself on its own or was some other factor, I don't know. But the good news is it didn't do very well.
The Sunday, just a few days ago on Sunday on State of the Union, you told Dana Bash that North Korea will have a nuclear missile that will be able to reach California by President Trump's second term. Is the development of the ability to launch such a missile in itself a red line? Meaning, if it becomes a certainty that they have that technology, would the U.S., without question, strike to prevent it from happening?
Well, I don't have too much insight, actually, into the intelligence of how they're doing, other than to know that certainly when I was on active duty, they were doing very well, and I believe they will have the technology. Unfortunately for Mr. Trump, all of the attempts in previous administrations to somehow get them to be more responsible, that is to say, to stop their technology, missile technology development and the atomic development. They tried to do it, and they essentially failed. And I don't criticize them. They did try. Mr. Obama, Mr. Bush, probably Mr. Clinton. But it has fallen on this president that they will, in my opinion, have a workable missile, ICBM-type missile that can certainly hit the United States. Not all of the United States, but hit the United States. And they're working hard to develop a weapon to put on that missile. I would say that I think, you know, if we can predict it, it's going to happen on this day, we need to stop it before they get to that point.
President Trump says that North Korea is his biggest global concern. Is North Korea your biggest domestic concern?
North Korea?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you said, Jake? North Korea? Not right now. I mean, for me in the homeland, because they're not able, I believe, to strike the homeland yet, there's a lot of other things that are concerning me. But, you know, as that came closer and closer as a possibility, clearly the impact of a nuclear weapon on any part of our homeland would be catastrophic. There'd be a recovery aspect to that if it ever happened, God forbid. That would concern me greatly. You're talking about millions of lives and quite a bit of devastation and you know, environmental impact. But for right now, I'm worrying about other things, but I'm keeping a wary eye on what's going on the peninsula.
I want to get to those other things in a second, but just one last question. On the North Korea issue, what's your response to critics who suggest that President Trump's language and rhetoric about the North Korean issue might actually be increasing tensions?
Well, I don't think they're increasing tensions at all. This guy that's running, or the dictator in North Korea, is on his own program. You know, even China and others are trying to influence him to stop his actions. I think what Mr. Trump is doing, in my mind, is outlining the threat and the very real possibility that this guy, the dictator there, could have a nuclear weapon in the not too distant future that could be married to a ICBM. I think any president that didn't talk about it in stark terms would not be doing his job.
Do you think that Kim Jong-un is mentally unbalanced?
Oh heck, I don't know. You know, he seems like someone who knows what he's doing. I mean, clearly, the number one thing in his mind is to remain in power. I think in the dynamic of a dictatorship like that, he's got to do that by convincing everyone around him, first of all, holding them all in stark terror, and convincing everyone around him that he's a strong man and is willing to stand up and all the rest of the rhetoric. I think the only way to decide whether he's insane or not is to lay him down on a couch and have a battalion's worth of psychiatrists talk to him and figure it out. The thing that keeps me up at night, no doubt, Jake, is the attempt of terrorists to knock down an airplane in flight. There's a number of ways to do that. Obviously, explosives are the way to do it for sure. And we're doing the best we can. The good news is we know from various ways that the terrorists respect our, that is to say, United States TSA type operations. They've respected greatly. We're considered to be a hard target. I hope that works. That's a deterrent, hopefully. They're trying. We hear it all the time in the chatter. There's let me say, a few. Some of the chatter is real. Some of it is specific. And in an abundance of caution, we have to date decided to, at best, inconvenience travelers at certain airports on the way to the United States, to inconvenience them by making them put large electronic devices in their checked baggage. They can still bring the devices, of course, but that's in the checked baggage, and I guess they're forced to read a book or a magazine or talk to their kids. I don't know, but I'd rather that inconvenience than you know, a flaming ball of fire coming down at from 30,000 feet. To your point about expanding it, we're constantly looking, constantly listening, constantly trying to figure out what they're doing. And I would have no hesitation to expand the limitation on carrying electronic devices on airplanes bound for the United States if the threat and my evaluation of that threat brought me to that point. No hesitation at all.
What would need to be the profile of the country to avoid a ban on electronics being brought on board by a passenger? Would the country need to have airport security equal or about equal to what we have in the United States? In other words, are we looking at a possibility where almost every country except for like Australia, France, and England, you're not allowed to bring electronics on a flight to the United States?
Well, let me make the point first of all. There was some pretty irresponsible reporting, not by this, certainly not by you and not by this network, that we did this because they were Muslim countries, or that they were or they were Arabs, or we wanted to influence the profit margin of a overseas foreign carrier to advantage our own carriers. Totally irresponsible. Never was part of my factor or any of the factors that I looked into when I banned when I implemented the new protocol in the 10 airports. Just you know, the threat is real. There's one airport that is on the list of 10 right now that has come forward to make a suggestion that if they were on a volunteer basis, if passengers were willing to go through the inconvenience of having their electronic devices opened up, inspected visually, and checked with explosive residue detection devices, would that be enough? I'm considering that, but this has nothing to do with the airports, has nothing to do with their attempts at trying to prevent this. This is a different kind of threat. It's real. And for right now, an abundance of caution, we have certainly restricted the direct flights or carrying electronic devices in the passenger compartments to the United States out of 10 airfields.